Hello, I'm Jim Falk. Thanks for joining us. The opioid epidemic kills nearly 300 Americans every day, with most of these overdose deaths tied to fentanyl poisoning. Recognizing the gravity and to raise awareness, and we hope to prevent more fatalities, we recently devoted here at Perspectives Matters 3 programs to the subject, and these are all available for viewing on McQuistonTV.com. Now we turn to the geopolitics of fentanyl. Specifically, how are China and Mexico enabling the production and importation of illicit drugs into the United States, and what options are being proposed to counter what is certainly continuing to be a growing problem? Let's welcome our guest. Dr. Vanda Felbab-Brown is a senior fellow at Brookings, where she co-directs the think tank series, The Opioid Crisis in America, Domestic and International Dimensions. She's a recognized expert on organized crime and illicit economies. Also joining us today is Dr. Jeffrey Singer. He's a physician who is a senior fellow in health policy studies at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. So help us understand really the supply. What is the supply chain for fentanyl? How does it get to the United States?
These days, the precursor chemicals for fentanyl are mostly produced, their overwhelming majority is produced in China, and they are shipped from China to Mexico, where the two large cartels, the Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, synthesize them into fentanyl and then smuggle finished fentanyl in various forms into the United States. The vast majority of pills that are fake pills, fake prescription pills that contain fentanyl or perhaps are just sold fentanyl are produced in Mexico.
Now, we continue to see people talk about always China and Mexico, but are there other countries that are involved, especially in the manufacture of the precursors?
Well, India is a place where, just like in China, there is a large, poorly regulated chemical and pharmaceutical industry that is certainly deeply implicated in the production of synthetic drugs and precursors for synthetic drugs. And there is some connection between Mexican criminal groups, the Sinaloa cartel, and fentanyl precursor importation. There is certainly a high potential that India could become a place from which much greater amounts of fentanyl precursors originate. But so far, for the Mexico-US trade, the vast majority of precursors do come from China.
You know, I wouldn't think that China would really want the reputation of being a drug trafficker. And I wonder if you might elaborate on how the overall relationship with the United States, between the United States and China, which has certainly been a roller coaster, has affected the policy decisions between the two countries.
So certainly China does not want to be known as a country implicated in drug trafficking or with poor drug trafficking controls. The very opposite. China prides itself and positions itself as the world's leading drug cop, perhaps the country with toughest drug policies and drug laws. And China disavows any kind of role or responsibility for what's going on in the United States, systematically blames poor morals in the United States, as well as the US pharmaceutical industry that was responsible for getting such vast numbers of people addicted to Oxycontin as the culprits. So this is China's official posture. Nonetheless, the reality is that China is the source of precursor for fentanyl, just as it is the source of precursors for methamphetamine. That is also devastating the United States, but it's also devastating East Asia and the Asia Pacific region, including Australia and New Zealand. And China does have limited controls over the production of these precursors. Part of the challenge is structural. There are very many ways to alter the chemical signature. This is what makes synthetic drugs so different from plant-based drugs. And many of the precursors today are legal chemicals. They are not scheduled. They are not banned. So this is, again, very different than a finished product like cocaine or heroin that might be fully proscribed in the international narcotics regime. The precursors from which fentanyl and meth today are being made are chemicals of dual use. In fact, they have widespread usage in just basic chemistry, basic pharmaceutical processes. So there is very little chance that there will be scheduled, that there will be restricted. So there are these structural inherent law enforcement challenges for any countries, including China. But the story is more complicated. In some cases, quite often, in fact, it is very visible, very brazen, and quite in the open, in which Chinese brokers sell the precursors to Mexican cartels. They blatantly advertise that they know how to evade law enforcement controls in Mexico. They blatantly advertise formulas how to use the legal drugs they're selling to be made into fentanyl.
When you say blatantly advertise, what do you mean? Is this on the dark web or how does it
Yeah,
work?
absolutely. So, on the dark web, they will provide um, ads that will say, here are fillers for cocaine, here are precursors for fentanyl, or code words, but nonetheless code words that people in the illegal drug business understand. And they will provide formulas. This is how you take our products. We will teach you how you make fentanyl out of it. So they know they are selling to criminal actors for illegal purposes. And China has been reluctant to act even against such blatant visibility. And this reluctance to act really culminated in the summer of 2022, after then Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, when China officially said it was ending all law enforcement cooperation, including counter-narcotics cooperation with the United States.
What leverage does the United States have? Would sanctions be able to be used, or any type? I mean, we're already doing so many issues on trade. Is there something else that we should or could
Well,
be doing?
absolutely, Jim. And here you are really getting into why does China not want to cooperate?
Yeah.
And it has to do with very different calculations in the US government and in the Chinese government as to where limited cooperation comes in. So the Biden administration came to office with the view that it would increase competition with China. It understood China as being the major threat to the US interest in the Asia Pacific and around the world. And it would then increase competition in a whole variety of domains, certainly in building alliances, in the technological domain, in the defense domain, and select and put aside areas where it believed there was overlap of interest, such as drugs and such as climate. And so, the US calculation has been we can compete in these national security domains where we want to compete, but we will cooperate in other issues when we want to cooperate. And China has refused to operate on the basis of these propositions. In fact, the view in China is we cooperate if we get something out of it. And what the something out of it is change in the geostrategic relationship. So China has at various times extended both to the United States and to other Western countries like Australia counter narcotics and law enforcement cooperation, with the calculation that it would get improvements, significant improvements in the overall geostrategic relationship.
Hmm.
So with respect to the US, we had a peak of cooperation in 2017, 2018, when still during the Trump administration, when China was hoping that by extending counter-narcotics cooperation, at the time scheduling the entire fentanyl class of drugs, there are many analogs of fentanyl, so China would agree to schedule all the analogs of fentanyl. And it expected that the Trump administration would ease the economic competition, the economic tariffs on China. That did not happen. There is some indication from China that they might be willing to return to some level of cooperation. There have been steady signaling when Secretary Blinken went to China in the spring. Fentanyl was again high on the agenda. There was the expectation that a joint working group would be set up or resurrected. There had been a working group before.
Well, let's go into another area. Three leading Republican candidates for president and a number of representatives in Congress have been talking about using perhaps the U.S. military or special forces to go into Mexico to try to eliminate the cartels. One, could we do that? Uh, would there be any support for an authorization to use military force in Mexico for this purpose?
So no, the U.S.-Mexico cooperation has gone through many periods of very, very limited, very meager cooperation. Unfortunately, we are in the state where the Mexican government under President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador has eviscerated and sabotaged cooperation. Nonetheless, even at times when we had far greater cooperation, the greatest cooperation ever during the Felipe Calderon administration in Mexico, the notion that the US military would be taking actions on Mexican soil was really anathema to the people in Mexico and Mexican government officials, Mexican politicians. And in the fraud relationship that has emerged since, this would be enormously politically explosive and would generate a set of repercussions against across the entire spectrum of U.S.-Mexico relations. Two countries that are deeply intertwined economically, socially, um, and in very many other ways.
Well, plus you know so much more about this than I do, but it just seems to me you'd be searching for a needle in a haystack.
Well, sadly, some of the needles are quite visible, and I say sadly because here is where the lack of cooperation from the Mexican government is both egregious and painful. It's not actually so difficult to find the fentanyl labs.
Mm.
The problem that we have is that the Mexican president is denying there is any production of fentanyl in Mexico and has been in general reluctant and unwilling in his administration to take on the cartels. The bigger issue is not that we could not find fentanyl labs and take them out, or for that matter, that special operations forces could not kill particular individual. But these would be limited, sporadic actions, and to resurrect the fentanyl lab is enormously easy. To recreate leadership for a cartel is what Mexico is also enormously easy, and the consequence is this enormous violence that Mexico has been struggling with. So we need to take meaningful action against the cartels that are destroying not just lives in the United States, they are um, increasingly controlling ever larger territories, segments of population, and even legal economies in Mexico. The cartels are truly eating Mexico alive while the Mexican government is
So,
standing on the sidelines.
so if I understand what you're saying correctly, perhaps we're putting too much attention just on fentanyl, that we need to realize that the cartel's impact and corruption is much broader and is having greater impact on Mexico's politics as well as our bilateral relationship.
Well, yes, indeed. And so, I think there are multiple dimensions to it. In some of my recent congressional testimonies, I have argued that even in the actions that we take in the United States and in places where we can operate, such as international waters, we really need to understand that we should move beyond simply focusing, targeting the fentanyl flows alone, important as that is, and really think of much more multifaceted ways to counter the cartels, including because drugs, even fentanyl, are really a small segment of the cartel's portfolios and activity. And we'll be able to have far greater impact on the network, on their financial capacity, on their political connections. If we go after a wide variety of activities in which they are engaged, such as illegal fishing, such as wildlife trafficking, such as their connections to the Chinese that we have been talking about.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us. You certainly brought up a lot of issues that I know I haven't thought of, and I suspect our viewers learned a lot today, too. So thanks again, Dr. Brown.
My pleasure.
Dr. Singer, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So we all know what an epidemic opioid poisoning has been, especially with fentanyl. Are we seeing here in 2023 any leveling off, decrease, or is it continuing to increase?
Researchers at the University of Pittsburgh School of Public Health in 2018, we looked at data from the CDC going back as far as they can get the data. And they concluded that the overdose death rate in this country has been on an exponential growth, has been growing exponentially, at least since 1979. And that the only thing that has changed over the years is which particular sets of drugs are predominating at any given point in time. And they also see no evidence that the exponential growth trend is slowing in any way. And that's because of prohibition. So economists talk about the Alkean-Allen effect, and drug policy analysts call that the iron law of prohibition, which basically is the harder the law enforcement, the harder the drug will be. And we saw that, for example, during the days of alcohol prohibition. Smugglers weren't smuggling in beer and wine, they were smuggling in whiskey. Prohibition incentivizes the drug dealers and the cartels to come up with more potent forms of the drugs, so they are smaller in size, could be smuggled in more easily and divided.
Wait, I want to be sure I understand. You're saying that because we have so much enforcement, which I thought in some cases is lacking, but because we have so much enforcement, that's why there's such a increase?
That's correct. The harder the enforcement, the harder the drug. So, for example, there's a real life example that we see today at football games. When people are tailgating outside, they're drinking beer and wine, but you're not allowed to bring any alcohol into the stadium. So what do they bring into the stadium? They bring in the hard stuff in flasks. They don't bring in beer and wine. So it's an economic principle that if you're going to take the risk of smuggling, the greater the risk becomes, the more you have incentives to come up with ways of making what you're smuggling more potent, so they could be smuggled in smaller sizes and be able to evade the enforcement. But also that when you finally come across to the other side, you could actually sell that smaller amount in more units and make more money. So that the risk is what incentivizes the harder drugs. That's why, for example, in the early part of this century, the most predominant drug found among opioid-related overdose deaths was diverted prescription pain pills. These are prescription pain pills that found their way into the black market for non-medical users. In fact, the government's own National Survey on Drug Use and Health found that less than 25% of non-medical users ever even obtained a prescription. They were getting it on the black market or from friends or relatives. So then when doctors were basically pressured to reduce prescribing, which of course hurt a lot of patients in pain, the source of prescription pain pills started to diminish, and the cartels immediately replaced that with heroin. Then around 2012, we started seeing fentanyl, which is a synthetic opiate that's been around since the 1970s, and it's very potent. It's about 50 times the potency of heroin, started getting mixed in with heroin to kind of boost its potency, so the heroin packets could be smuggled in smaller sizes. By 2016, the number of opioid-related overdose deaths containing fentanyl eclipsed those containing prescription pain pills or heroin. And by 2017, 50% of all opioid-related overdose deaths involved heroin. By 2022, 90%. And now we've been hearing a lot of reports of the veterinary tranquilizer xylazine, which drug users call tranq.
That's the one that eats your skin, isn't it?
Well, yes. When you inject it, if it gets outside of the vessel into the skin, it can cause terrible ulcers because it constricts the tiny vessels, and those ulcers can then become infected. There have been cases where people have had to have limb amputations to save their lives. So now that's being mixed in. One report about 6 months ago from the Drug Enforcement Administration said that about 40% of the fentanyl they're seizing now has xylazine in it. But we're also hearing reports starting in 2019 of another synthetic opioid. The category is called nitazines, and isotonitazine is the one in particular. Users call it ISO. This is a synthetic opioid that's maybe 20% more potent than fentanyl. It was originally developed in the 50s by Ciba Geigy, but it never was brought to market. So in about 2019, it was reported in overdose deaths toxicology studies in Europe.
Does it have a legitimate purpose, just like fentanyl does?
Well, it was developed for a legitimate purpose, but it was never brought to market. So but the compound exists, the chemical exists, and so we're seeing that being made in, clandestine labs. In about a year ago, the Tennessee Department of Health reported a fourfold increase in overdose deaths containing nitazines, or ISO as they call it, compared to 2019. Now that drug hasn't gotten much attention, so it's not on the radar screen of a lot of health departments around the country. So a lot aren't testing for it. It might even be more prevalent than we're aware of. But the point I'm making is there's always going to be, as long as there's an incentive for purveyors of prohibited substances to develop more potent forms because of the risks they're taking, then that's going to keep happening. It's not going to stop. It's like playing a game of whack-a-mole.
Well, let me ask you this. We know that a lot of the precursors for fentanyl come from China. The other drugs that you mentioned, and I don't dare try to pronounce the last one, where is that? Where are the precursors coming from?
I don't know the answer to that one, but we're starting to see more and more precursors for fentanyl come from India now. And that's another thing. It's a game of whack-a-mole. So if there's a market, obviously, for these precursors, and so all of these efforts to clamp down, we all recall in the late 1990s under President Clinton, we had what they call Plan Colombia, which was the idea to clamp down on smuggling, particularly of cocaine from Colombia. Cocaine prices have never been lower. So if it was successful, you would expect the price to go up because of scarcity, law of supply and demand. But they've never been lower than they are now. And all it did was move that illicit business to Central America and Mexico. And so as we try to clamp down on one source, it'll just pop up somewhere else. That's the way prohibition works.
It's interesting that you brought up Colombia because Representative Crenshaw of Texas has argued or suggested that we ought to look at the Colombian model for Mexico.
Yeah, I think that's a fool's errand. But the other thing is, of course, when we did that in Colombia, we put the people of Colombia through a lot of hell. In the crime waves, we empowered the guerrilla forces of the FARC. And of course, like I say, what do we have to show for it? Cocaine has never been cheaper, and it's just coming in from Central America and Mexico. But if we try to do that in Mexico, you're talking about these labs that are making fentanyl. This is not like growing coca leaves in forests. This is something you can synthesize in a basement. So you're talking about urban warfare. Okay, you're talking about something that's not analogous to what's going on right now in Gaza, or what we had to deal with in Fallujah and Mosul and places like that. So. And not only that, but the cartels are involved in multiple businesses. They're involved in money laundering and human smuggling, in all sorts of businesses. And if some, like we heard rumors recently of the Sinaloa cartel saying, I don't believe them, saying they're getting out of the opioid smuggling business, but there are several other cartels, and they're just going to go into another business, and the business they're giving up will be picked up by another cartel. I think it's a fool's errand to think that you could stop this, but worse than that, we could do a lot of harm to our neighbors in Mexico and destabilize the government there, and probably stimulate an exodus of refugees across our border. I just think it's a mistake, and it shows a lack of understanding for how these drugs are made. These are made in basements. These could be made in garages. You can't just come in with a SWAT team and get them.
Oh, I remember we were talking to one person who said it could be in a broom closet, but you're going to have to help me, Dr. Singer, because there's something I'm missing in what you're suggesting. And that is, you're saying that we should, in a sense, make the drugs more available, less enforcement. And yet, we know that fentanyl is a very dangerous additive. And so we don't want people to be taking fentanyl. I mean, it's one thing if they take an opioid or heroin or marijuana, but if fentanyl is laced in that prescription drug, these people who are taking it, even if it's legal, are going to die. What am I missing?
Well, when I go to my drug dealer, which is the corner liquor store, because that's a legal drug, and I ask my dealer where the shelf is that has the bourbon, because that's my drug of choice, and I see on the label it says 45% alcohol, it never even crosses my mind that it could be laced with fentanyl, or that they may be lying to me and it's 80% alcohol, or that it's something else altogether different. And that's because it's legal and regulated. So ideally, The evidence is, and there's some researchers at UC San Francisco that research this, most people who are using fentanyl now they prefer heroin. It's a completely different experience. Quoting the research studies, the heroin users say heroin is, quote, warm and fuzzy, and fentanyl is bold and brash. But you take what you can get on the black market. And many of them, if they knew it contained fentanyl, or they thought they were, for example, purchasing an OxyContin pill or oxycodone pill that turned out to be made by the cartels and was really made of fentanyl, if they knew that, they'd either not take it or take less or adjust their dose. So if we can't bring ourselves politically to end prohibition, like we've finally wised up in the 30s about alcohol, then at least what we should do is put the focus on harm reduction. So, for example, in many states, including Texas, it's illegal to hand a fentanyl test strip to people so they could test their illegally obtained drug to see if it has fentanyl in it and make a decision accordingly.
And we should mention that the governor changed his position. He's now in favor of it. And the House and a state legislator voted for it, but the Senate has not passed it or approved it.
And actually also the stricter border controls, which make it harder to sneak things through, they just incentivize them to come up with much more potent forms of drugs. And a lot of times in the early days when fentanyl started appearing on the scene, most heroin users were disappointed, but they settled for fentanyl. Now a lot of them, their tastes are changing.
Well, you've brought up a lot of interesting arguments, and I really appreciate your perspective. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
As of this month, over 62,400,000 fentanyl pills and 9,700 pounds of fentanyl powder have been confiscated by the United States government. That represents 287 million deadly doses, 287 million. As our two experts highlighted, the financial profit, the ease by which illicit drugs can cross legal borders, and the demand for the finished product create extraordinarily challenging obstacles. And yet there are steps that are being taken and considered which might just turn the tide. Thank you for watching, where we talk about things that matter with people who care. I'll see you next time.